Hello, welcome back to FIN340 Real Estate. Today we'll be covering chapters 1 and 2, lecture 1, part 2. So let's get right into it here. Here's an overview of what we'll be doing today. We'll be looking at how to read the textbook and the course materials. We'll review chapter 1, which really has to do with career opportunities in real estate. And then we will move on to chapter 2, which is a bit more in-depth and deals with real estate definitions. What is land? What is real estate? What is real property? What are improvements or fixtures to those real properties? It's a hard one to say. Appurtenances, which are basically easement rights, which will actually be discussed in more detail in chapter 3. Water rights, and then land description methods, how they go about actually describing the land in the books, the lot plat books. And we will continue off with that with a bit of a discussion about lot types in the lot plat books. And that's it for this lecture. So let's begin. You were supposed to purchase Jacobus's Real Estate and Introduction to the Profession. Reading this book in extreme detail is extremely useful to the class. It's going to be necessary for you to read every chapter and every page within the chapter if you can. There are also important things at the end of the chapter, which are the questions. So questions tend to be useful little guidelines for what will be on the exam. I suggest that you look through the review questions in the book, and if you have any questions for me, I can try and help you out with those. But they will be a good source for use in the exam. The answers are in the Appendix D at the end of the book. So core words are also bolded in this text, so you should probably know those. They will be a source of questions for the exam as well, whether you can understand the key terms and legal terms used for the real estate profession as I described in the syllabus. Figures. So your text often makes use of very nice figures. I can only suggest that you attempt to really study these figures and understand them. They will provide you a great deal of information. So go through the text, read it, and when you come to a figure, try and really understand how that relates to the text. Don't just skip over it. The figures are extremely useful for an abstract concept, especially real estate law. All right, for Module 1, you are expected to read the following chapters: 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, and 10. 8 chapters in total. Chapters 1 and 2 are covered in this video. The remaining chapters are part of the next parts of Lecture 1, which are continued on throughout the week. So, without further ado, Chapter 1. The career opportunities is really all we are interested in about Chapter 1. The remainder of Chapter 1 is a foreword on how to read the textbook, which is somewhat interesting and won't take you long to read. I suggest you do it, but we're not going to lose sleep if you don't. But career opportunities are usually useful to discuss with respect to the material taught in a class. It helps you know how you might use this material if you were to actually get a job in the field. So here are a few jobs we can look at. Residential brokerage is a pretty common job in real estate. In fact, the most known job in real estate. There are buyers or sellers agents. You need a license for that. And they have pretty low commission, but a relatively high frequency of occurrence on that commission. But it could take you as much as 3 to 6 months to get started with your first sale. So if you're going to enter residential brokerage, you need to make sure that you have enough money set aside in order to maintain the C's, as your book puts it, or maintain your budgets to make sure that you don't go bankrupt in the time that it takes to make your first sale. When you make your first sale, it then becomes easier to make additional sales thereafter, as you are going to be referred by your prior clients onto new clients, and will have a better rating system as a residential brokerage. You do need to get a broker's license, which requires a significant amount of studying and licensure at the state level. If you move to a different state, you have to take a different licensure exam, unless they reciprocate. Again, this class is not designed to provide you the information for a licensure exam explicitly. You may need additional classes if you plan to do that, but it is meant to give you a foundation in the real estate investment principles. Commercial brokerage is more interesting in my opinion because that is where you get into the sale and purchase of apartment buildings and office buildings, retail stores, warehouses, malls, etc. The commercial brokerage has a great deal more commission. I labeled it medium commission because there's another one that is a higher commission. But medium commission means tens of thousands of dollars, if not in the six figures, for the purchase of the property. However, their frequency is not very large. They don't have, or very often rather, they don't happen very often because commercial brokerage exchanges are typically done on a very long-term rental agreement, 5 to 10 years, maybe longer. The longest lease agreement I have ever read about was 100-year rights to land under commercial use. So a 100-year agreement. Obviously, they cannot break that agreement for 100 years without paying significant fees, so that property is not going to be released for another 100 years. That's a very low frequency. But that's just to give you an example. Industrial brokerage is very much similar to commercial brokerage, but it has to do with finding land and or buildings which are appropriate for manufacturing or utility plants. So these are very large tracts of land. They have to be zoned for industrial usage. So we've actually got the three zoning requirements here: residential zoning, commercial zoning, and industrial zoning. So residential is where people live. Commercial is generally participation in retail or apartment building properties. And industrial has to do with manufacturing, traditionally speaking, although it also has to do with utilities for the generation of power, and water sources will be under industrial brokerage as well. Industrial brokerage, because they're such large pieces of land with such large buildings that are going to be placed on them, have very high commissions, usually millions of dollars. And it's usually going to be a large firm that's going to handle this, and the commission will be split up among a fairly significant team because they require advanced knowledge of the land law and advanced knowledge of environmental protection and manufacturing and supply chain in order to make sure that you structure the deal accordingly, that you get the right tax havens if you are in one state versus in another, and you're transacting over the state border. If you're going to be manufacturing in one state but selling to another, you've created what's called nexus as far as taxes are concerned. It becomes very complicated, and usually a large real estate firm will handle those sort of transactions. Farm brokerage is becoming less common than in the past. In the past, it used to be very common for people to buy farms from one another as they kind of aged out and needed to pass it on to the next generation or give it to a new set of family who was looking to homestead. Homestead meaning move from the city into the farming region to live the rural life. So this today actually applies to those, again, small homestead farms, but also large agribusinesses. So these companies can range from 1,000 square acreages to up to 4 to 5 square miles in distance, which is tens of thousands of acres of square acreage there. Very, very large. Knowledge of the agribusiness often required, so you need to know soils and plants and where animals will be able to live. Waste use is extremely important. For example, in North Carolina, they have significant problems with drainage of hog waste, which is not well developed in those regions. So farm brokerages would have a reason to look into those things when they're trying to determine the value of the property. And tax laws are very unique to farms as well. So farm brokerages are going to look into the tax laws and see where you can save money on your taxes in order to provide a benefit that might make the farm profitable. Property management is a very interesting way of dealing with real estate, which doesn't necessarily mean you're invested in real estate. In fact, somebody else is invested in real estate and you are going to manage that property for them. Effectively, you're going to be the leasing agent and the maintenance person, or man, lady, if you would, it doesn't matter either way there. But they're going to take care of the property. They're going to deal with all of the replacement of, fridges and air conditioning units, everything that would not be covered by the tenant. But they also are in charge of leasing the properties. And most of you probably have interacted with a property manager at some point. Whether you realized it was a property manager or not. You may have just thought it was a leasing agent. But if that person also is in charge of fixing things around the dwelling, then they are also a property manager. They are paid on salary, and they usually stay in the office all day. It's not terribly a very interesting job after you figured out all of the mechanics and everything's leased out, provided your maintenance is done well, there's not a whole lot to do. So it can be a fairly cushy job And they get an additional bonus if there is a watermark met for how many units are rented, for example. So if 85% of the units in a condominium are rented out, then that property manager will get a bonus. Rental listing services are not something we're going to cover in great detail, but they just collate information for a bunch of apartments and apartment units and condominiums and for sale into a single service, which is usually cataloged and can be indexed and searched. You can think of Zillow, or in Morgantown, for example, morgantownapartments.com. I don't know if it's very well used anymore, but it used to be one of the larger ways to figure out whether there was someplace available for you to rent in the Morgantown area. So those are rental listing services. Real estate appraising and government services. Real estate appraising is important for determining the fair value of the asset apart from what the localized market selling price is. So what we mean there is that somebody else has sold a house that's very similar down the street, but perhaps because of where your house is located, it has a different value. And we'll talk about corner or through lots or key lots later. But corner lots have more value than key lots. So simply because your house exists on a corner, it may have a higher appraisal value than the same exact copy house who is the next lot over, who is a key lot. So this has to do with real estate appraising. And appraising is so important because the market value of the house may not be the same as the appraising value of the house, and the appraising value is what is used for tax purposes. This is often the case where somebody gets and they purchase a house at $300,000, and the house is then appraised at $350,000, and they have to pay more property taxes. Also, after somebody has purchased a house 30 years ago, something of this nature, and the house becomes reappraised, they may have purchased the house for $100,000, but since it was 30 years ago, the house is now worth $300,000, and their property taxes are increased significantly. In many cases, they cannot afford to live in the house any longer, and they must sell. So real estate appraising has become a very complicated business because of its attachment to taxes. Unfortunately, however, because it is so complicated to do appraising services now, the pay does not often outrank that of a residential broker, which again was very low commission and high frequency, so it almost has no benefit to becoming an appraiser rather than a residential broker. And today, few people become appraisers, and it's very difficult to get appraising services done now, and the cost is beginning to go up. Government services. So the United States government controls 30% of the land in the United States, which is a very large number. The buying and selling of this property is completed by government service agents who deal in real estate, either in the first market by buying and selling openly between the buyer and the seller. They agree to a price and they just simply transact there. Or if no transaction can come to pass, they use eminent domain, which we will discuss in Chapter 3. Land development is the construction on property itself. So typically what you do is you take a very large lot and you split it up and you place basically internal replica houses, which may have a veneer or the outside, which looks different to the one to the right and the left, but it may look very similar to one very just down the street. So they use these patterned subdivisions, and they're very common in the South and in the Midwest. They're not that common in the mid-states and the northern states, which have a bit more uniqueness to them. But these pattern houses allow for the development of larger housing units because they're replicated. They can be constructed faster. So they construct the walls ahead of time, ship all of the walls at once, and simply put them together on site. So you can build up to 1,000 homes in the course of only a few years, which is a very quick development plan. And it rivals, I was just in China, and in China is doing something very similar, but they're doing with apartment buildings. So whereas in America we see large tracts of land turned into subdivisions, individual houses separated by small amounts of land between them, in China they're building tons and tons of skyscraper apartment buildings. But again, they're all just replicated land development. They're very profitable if you do them well, provided you're a good contractor. it is easy to have your cost be too high as a contractor, and that will completely eliminate all of your overhead margin, your gross margin there. And when you do that, you end up going bankrupt. And that is one of the reasons that many contractors end up going bankrupt. Or they try and use low quality materials lower than what was agreed upon in the construction contract, which will often get them in trouble. So land development is its own interesting little game, and we will talk about it a little bit more later. Urban planning has to do with zoning and the reconstruction, gentrification, the replanning of the land allotment within typically a city. So what they're going to do, let's say we want to demolish a set of buildings like they did in Shadyside in Morgantown a few years ago, predominantly because there was a scenes of riots, and those houses were seen as lower income housing. The way that the city of Morgantown went about eliminating the riot threat was to condemn the houses and use eminent domain to purchase them out. And in the process, they sold the property back to West Virginia University, who then built University Place, a very large and expensive high-rise on top of it. The idea would be there to gentrify the area, increase the rents, and therefore increase the price of homes in the area and eliminate low-income housing problems. The issue with that is it displaces low-income housing individuals, people who need to live there because they cannot afford the new and expensive units that were placed there now. So these individuals had to move elsewhere, just simply shifted the location of the problem. It didn't solve the problem. So it's very difficult to do urban planning. It's as much as a real estate problem as it is economics and political science, because you may end up moving. For example, if you were a Republican candidate who typically caters to a middle-ranged income, if you end up moving all of the lower income candidates voting who vote for Democrats typically into a Republican region on accident, you may flood the region with votes for the Democratic Party and lose your seat. So it's very much so a political science issue as well. Mortgage financing is a typical path for finance students who go out into real estate or want to enter into real estate, because it tends to be something that meshes with what we teach in academe as far as finance is concerned. It has more to do with focusing on the security of the lending and the credit of the lending individual who we're lending to than the actual valuing of the property or figuring out whether it's a good price. Securities and syndication has to do with REITs and ETFs. We'll talk about these in greater detail later. They allow partial investment into large real estate projects, and they also allow for the funding of those large real estate projects. So something like a super mall, Pittsburgh Mills up in near above Pittsburgh, is a very large real estate project that cost several $100 million. And it required a syndication of loans and investment products from other banks to come together and fund that project so it could be built. Consulting is providing service for real estate. It typically revolves around sprucing up the property, so figuring out the landscaping needs to be corrected, or the decorations on the inside, or maybe it needs renovated. Maybe there are structural problems with the property, but also has to do with zoning and taxes and title law, and all can be covered under consulting. So typically a person or firm will do this after they have done many years of full-time investing, which we'll come to next. So a full-time investor is somebody who invests their own money in real estate properties, typically for the rental purposes. So what they'll do is they'll go buy an apartment building that has not been well maintained, and they may buy it for cheap, or it may be foreclosed. In the 2008 collapse, there were a lot of buildings that went under foreclosure, and they can get it for very little money, and then they rent out and renovate the property, and they produce higher rents, and those rents pay for the mortgage on the property. And eventually they're able to write off the full amount of the mortgage and live completely on the cash flows that are generated thereafter. So it's a very nice method of doing things. It can be pretty risky and very difficult, but substantially able to allow people to move to retirement pretty early if they're able to pull it off. Excuse me. So, chapter 2, one second here. Chapter 2 is focused on basically definitions in real estate and how do we identify what land constitutes real estate land and where is that land explicitly, and the terminology that surrounds that discussion. So we've broken this into really 4 large topics here: real estate, what is it and what it isn't; rights in the land and property, so what are some of the rights we have to discuss with respect to real estate; fixtures, appurtenances, water rights, land descriptions via metes and bounds, or the rectangular survey system. And learning these terms are going to be extremely important for you to understanding how things are valued in the future, particularly, as I said before, with respect to where the lot is. So we need to be able to identify the lot, and the way that does in America is that these are written into books. And these books are a matter of public record. So all of these books are held in the LAT system within the county clerk's office, and you can simply walk into the county clerk's office and open a particular book if you knew which book you were looking for, find the particular page that you were looking for, and then you would be able to find the property and exactly what outlines the perimeter of the property and where it exists. This seems very mundane and something that we would make bookies or paralegal assistants do, and it's something we do make them do, but it's also extremely important as a real estate investor to understand where the bounds of your property are. You can come to a case, and I'll give you guys an example a little bit later, of where it would be financially feasible for you to ignore part of your property rights, or where you may be obligated to act upon the property rights if something sits within your property. An example of that is a bridge. So if there is a bridge which sits within your property, depending on whether there's an easement right on that bridge, you may or may not be responsible for repairing that bridge, even though the bridge was probably not constructed by you. If you purchased the property and the bridge was maintained within the property and there's no easement right, then you must repair the bridge, because you cannot allow it to fall into the water and damage the water rights. So it becomes very complicated. So understanding these rules and ordinances is extremely important to being a successful real estate investor. All right, real estate, also known as real property, is the physical and tangible land and the improvements or a fixed construction that is part of the land. So we have to be very careful here about what is land. Land does not just mean the physical surface of the land that you stand on. It means everything above and below as well. So this is a very interesting concept, but we're referring to land and real estate. Specifically, it means everything in the air and everything below the surface. Okay? So this is known as air rights, which are above the land, surface rights, which are the surface of the land itself and all of the homes and fixtures that are on top of that, and then subsurface rights, which sit below the land. This is generally mineral rights or water rights. We'll talk about percolation rights here in a little bit. But the rights for everything that exists under the land itself. So here, let me give you a little diagram we've got here. So if we were to imagine, let me get my stylus, that this is our land. Okay, then above here we've got air rights. And effectively what this means is that I can actually sell this part of my area above my land. So I could actually just write up a deed, a title transfer, and I could say I would like to sell 500 meters of air above my lot. Okay, and we'll just, for shits and giggles here, we'll call this lot 6. Okay, so I could say above lot 6, I would like to sell 500 meters of air above that, or 500 feet, whatever units you would like to use there. Okay, up to 600 feet. Okay? I would like to sell that area of air rights. Now, nobody may buy it, but you are allowed to sell it. Okay, air rights is a little bit interesting because typically we don't think about selling air rights, but air rights become extremely important when we're talking about condos. Okay, or apartments. Because when you're talking about an apartment, what you're really doing there is you've got a fixture that's standing in the air, okay, on the land. I'm going to attempt to draw, and this is not going to be very well, but we can see what we can do here. So we'll do a little apartment building there, and we'll... okay, so he's going to be in the air, and there's going to be a really hatchwork apartment, but bear with me. And we're going to have a few floors in this apartment building. So the question is, we want to sell these apartments. Well, when we're trying to sell the apartment, that is a real property. It's a real estate. But the issue is, well, it's not attached to the land exactly, is it? So this apartment here is not exactly attached to the land. It's sitting in the air. So how do we refer to this apartment? Well, we say the condominium, let's say this is 50 feet in the air. The condominium that sits on lot 6, 50 feet in the air. Well, we know that it's this condominium then, and I can sell this condominium. So that's what air rights is concerned with. In the air, above the land, who owns that property? Because we're not actually going to sell the underlying land. Especially in condominium and condo units, those are owned typically by the condo agency. Okay? So you're not going to purchase that land right when you buy the condo. Instead, what you are purchasing are the air rights. Additionally, we can have what are called mineral rights. So these are below the ground. Okay, I'm going to write these in brown. So these are mineral rights. And this can include anything from coal to gas, oil. Okay? Everything in that region that's under the ground that requires drilling or mining is going to be considered a mineral right. You can have mineral rights for silver, you can have it for gold, you can have it for any other item that you would like that's going to be underground. That's a mineral right. And additionally, on top of that, you can actually have water rights underground, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay? But if a stream runs underground in your property, you have the full rights so long as you own the mineral rights and surface rights to go in and drill. And we're going to draw a little drill here, and we're going to put this little pump in here. Okay, and we're going to be able to drill for the water, which is going to come up, boop, 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 and spew it onto our land. Okay, and make a little puddle here. So we have the right to do that. We're perfectly allowed to do that so long as we own the water right, which we'll get to in a second. We pretty much usually own the water right if it's below the property, and we own the mineral rights. Now be careful here. If the water right is under the mineral right, you may or may not be able to access the water. This is what is called easement. Okay? We will talk about easement in Chapter 3 in more detail. It also has to do with how do you access the property. In general, you are always able to access your property. That's the easement right. Okay? So because the mineral rights may sit above the water rights, then perhaps you can or cannot access the water. It depends on how strong the owner of the mineral rights is. Okay? So mineral rights are becoming a very large problem in West Virginia because many people, they own a farm, okay? They like to grow things on their farm, and that's fine, but it doesn't make them a ton of money, okay? So instead, what they do, particularly in West Virginia, where we are sitting on shale, they say to the mineral farmer, or mineral companies, coal and natural gas, they say, well, we will sell you, or we will lease you our mineral rights. So they come along, they say, yeah, we'll just buy all of this. Okay, so they come along and they buy out this mineral right. Okay, and then they're surprised. Nothing happens. 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, nothing happens. Okay, and nothing occurs. They just keep getting checks in the mail, and they think, oh, well, we'll just continue to enjoy our lives. And then lo and behold, a truck pulls up, and 500 feet from their house, they put in a well. Okay, I'm not going to be able to draw a very good well here, but they just plop it in here. Okay, these are supposed to be the counterweights that cause the well to work. Okay, and they begin to drill for oil. This is only 500 feet from their building, and you can imagine this is quite loud. And what they do is they sue the mineral right company, and they say, oh, you cannot drill there. And they say, we own the mineral rights. This is our property. We have the ability to access our property. This is our easement. And these individuals who own this farm, they lose in court because the mineral rights have the ability to access their property. The other issue that happens is that after these people lose in court, they often go bankrupt because the mineral right companies, basically the drilling companies, have large legal systems in place. Their lawyer teams are quite significant and very well trained, and they will usually countersue for the legal prices, the legal fees. So these individuals, they sell their farm. They get rid of it. They say, well, we have to move. We can't afford this property, so they sell the farm. Okay. So if we can imagine a little lot here, they're going to sell this, and to some Jones guy. Okay, Jones. So he buys the farm, and lo and behold, he is none the wiser that he does not own the mineral rights when he purchased the farm. In fact, the company who bought them originally, or leased them originally, still holds the mineral rights because they transferred with the property. Jones doesn't own those mineral rights. And then when they continue to drill on the property, or they drill in another place, Jones is also upset. But again, he can do nothing. Okay? So the mineral rights here is extremely important to understand, whether you are going to buy the property with mineral rights or not. Okay, we'll talk about that later. When you buy the property with mineral rights and you buy it with the air rights up here, and you buy the land, you buy everything, you buy all the rights. It's called fee simple. Fee simple. But we'll talk about that in more detail in chapter 3. Okay? But as you can see, it's very important to understand that there are multiple levels of rights depending on the vertical access of the property. Not just the surface of the land, but there are subsurface rights and air rights as well. Okay. Excuse me. Improvements are anything that is placed on the property that has been affixed to the land for the purpose of being permanently fixed to that land. Permanent is the key here. If it is permanently fixed to the land, it becomes part of the land itself, and therefore it is part of the estate or the ownership of that real land. Okay? But what does affixed means? This may seem obvious, but let's consider some examples here. A brick house. Okay, we'll come back to these in detail in a second, but just keep them in mind. A mobile home left on its trailer. A mobile home taken off its trailer with city water services or utility services of any kind. Curtains specifically designed to fit a large window. Okay, so again, a brick house, mobile home left on its trailer, a mobile home taken off of its trailer with city water services, and curtains specifically designed to fit a large window. So let's talk about personality, personality, not personality, okay? Personality, there's no I, okay? It is personal property versus, we will talk about real property, okay? It's intended to be movable. So if an object is on the land and it is intended to be movable, then it is probably personality. It is not specifically designed for the property itself, then it is personality. It is not otherwise stated in the real property deed to be part of the real property. So basically, if there's no other indication that that personal item should be included as part of the real property, then it's personality. And so long as it's intended to be moved and it is not specifically designed for the property itself, then it is considered as personal property. Real property is property affixed to the land itself. Affixed meaning directly and physically attached. Okay? It must be physically attached to the land. It is considered to be immovable. You cannot move it. Okay? If you were able to move it, then it would be personal property. You could remove it for the sake of the building or the land itself. Or it is detailed as part of the real property in some other document. So if some other law or agreement between individuals says it's part of the property, then it's part of the property. Okay? So you can generally write things to be part of the real property, but you cannot just write them back off to personality. Okay? So as the example we had before is a brick house. Is that personality or real property? Well, if you sit there and you think a brick house is situated and connected directly onto the land. Okay? Its foundation is built into the land itself. Then it is affixed to the land, so it is real property. A mobile home that is on wheels. This one seems like it is affixed to the property, but it is in fact not. It is also movable. Despite the fact that it is a home, under real estate law, it is considered personality. This is very important. If you get an insurance contract on real estate property, it does not cover a mobile home that is on wheels unless you get a rider for that property, which would say that it is specifically covered. The only way that you are allowed to cover that property, that mobile home, through the real estate insurance contract is if you remove the wheels. Okay? You affix it to the property by removing the wheels, and you have to go through some other sort of identification systems that are set up at the county level. But the key here is you have to take it off the trailer. Typically, it means you got to put it on cement blocks, and it has to sit on the ground. And a lot of people put skirts around it. Okay? So why am I making a big deal about this? Because it matters. Okay? If the mobile home should burn down and you left it on its wheels, the insurance assessor, if you had a real estate insurance policy, and they came along and they saw you were still on the wheels, they may say your house is not covered. Okay? Tough luck. If you had removed it from the wheels and placed it on cinder blocks, then it would be counted as covered under the real property insurance. Okay? So again, this is real property if it's off the wheels. So this is a very key distinction. What is personality and what is real property? Special curtains. Okay? This is a very unique item, but it drives home the point that if something is created specifically for the property that would not be used anywhere else, even though it's removable, it is considered part of the real property. Okay? So again, if something is created specifically for that property, even if it is movable, if you can take it out, it is still considered part of that real property because it is specific to the real property itself. So if you had special curtains designed for your windows, and they were not standard windows, then that would be part of the real property. If you had curtains designed for a pretty standard American window that could be removed and put on another window, then that would be personality. Okay? They would not be real property then. So we have a text for fixtures. The major test for fixtures to determine whether they are affixed to the property or not, and therefore part of real estate, is the manner of attachment. Is it physically attached? Okay? If it's on wheels, not physically attached. If it's on cinder blocks, physically attached. Okay? That's the manner of attachment. And traditionally, manner of attachment was the only way we determined fixtures. Okay? But modern days, we've got a little bit more complicated. Adaptation of the object. That is the description about the special curtains. Has the item been adapted specifically for the real estate in which it is used? Okay? Has it been specifically adapted for that real estate? Is it a special? If yes, then it is a fixture. It's part of the real estate. Doesn't matter if it's attached or not. Okay? So there's an example of where manner of attachment doesn't matter because it's not physically attached, but because it was specific to the real estate property, it has to be counted as real estate. Existence of an agreement. Remember before I said, so long as there's not an agreement which says this is or is not part of the real property. If there's an agreement between buyer and seller that a specific item exists as part of the real property and will remain and transfer with that real property, then it is part of the real property. An example of this might be, even though they are movable, okay, machinery used for farming. It may be considered part of the real property if the deed for sale includes it as part of the farm. Okay, they would just increase the price, but they would include it as part of the real property. Now, because there is an existence of an agreement, that item is considered part of the real property transfer. And the relationship of the parties. So this has to do with tenant and lessor agreements. So the example they use is if Walmart came in and rented a large retail space and they bolted their shelving units to the ground, okay, the bolting being the case there, it approves through manner of attachment that it is a fixture, and all fixtures are part of the real estate. Because it's part of the real estate, it is the property of the lessor, the owner of the real estate. not the property of Walmart, who rents the area. Okay? But under new common law, we say, well, there's a relationship of the parties here. That property, those shelves are actually belonging to Walmart. So regardless of the fact that they actually attach them to the cement ground for safety purposes, does not make them part of the real property, and they can remove them. However, of course, there's always a however. If Walmart did not remove the shelves when the lease was terminated, either early or on time, then those become the property of the landlord. Okay? Or they can choose to have them removed at the expense of the tenant. Okay? So again, it has to do with when it is left off of the lease and what's the relationship between the parties here. Okay? All right. Prior liens, trees, and plants, and emblements. Okay? Prior liens is fairly funny. So this is where credit lines, so you purchase, for example, an air conditioning unit at Sears, which would not happen now, but let's assume that it could. So you buy it at Sears and you put it on a credit card. And then you get down on your luck and they install it in your house and it works very well. And you're down on your luck, you lose your job and you default on your mortgage. And on the mortgage, you find a line that says lien for air conditioning. And you think to yourself, well, that's very strange. I used a credit card. I shouldn't have a lien on my personal property for the air conditioning. But the fact is that when the air conditioning was installed, it became part of the real property. And because there was a credit line established to back that air conditioning unit, that credit line attached itself to the real property. So this is considered a prior lien. Okay? So they have a secondary claim on the value of the property before you get any equity back on the distribution of the assets in bankruptcy. Okay? So you have to deal with prior lines and be very careful about it. Okay? If you're going to pay for credit on something and then have it attached to the real property as a fixture, they can apply a prior lien. Trees and plants that are planted on the property become the ownership of the real estate itself. Okay? Unless there's some other agreement. If you are a tenant and you plant a tree, okay, or shrubbery on the property, then it becomes the ownership of the lessor, the person who owns the land itself. Okay? You may be asked to remove it when you leave the tenancy agreement, or you can leave it there. But if you leave it there, it is not your property. Okay? You can remove it before your lease is up and keep that property with you. Okay? But it is very key that if you're going to plant something expensive, an expensive tree or an expensive flower, that you make sure to keep it in a potted plant or sign an agreement with your lessor, okay, to make sure that they agree that that is in fact your property, even if the lease were to come to an end. Okay? So the idea being there, if you had planted some very expensive rose bushes, okay, and for some reason your lease lapsed, you missed 3 payments, you went out of country and there was a horrific train accident, you had a medical issue, and you couldn't come back home and your lease lapsed, then your landlord would become owner of those rose bushes, not you. Okay? So you need to be very careful. I know this sounds a little bit strange, but it's somewhat important to think about, especially when there are expensive trees at task here. Implements are basically crops. So if you're going to plant anything for the purpose of harvesting, that is your personal property. Okay? It's personalty. It is not considered a trees or plants a fixed property to the land. The reason for this is that everyone who plants crops has the right to the harvest. So they have the right to benefit from their work. So they are entitled to harvest those crops even if their lease is over. Okay? And that is viewed as an easement right. So an easement right we talked about very briefly before, and again it comes back up in Chapter 3. It is the main focus of Chapter 3. Has to do with how someone accesses something that is their property. Your property cannot stop someone else from accessing their property. The ability for that other person to access their property ahead of your property or through your property is called an easement right. Okay? So generally easements are granted by necessity, which means that they are necessary to access the property. And emblements, crops, are considered an easement right. Appurtenances, another that's the fun word that's very difficult to say. These are easement rights or rights of way. Okay, they transfer with the land, and they can be as simple as, I need to get across your land to get to my land because my land is behind yours, and I have no other way of getting there from public roads. Well, then you would have an easement right or an appurtenances. Okay? They can also be very quirky. So if you bought a condominium unit and it came with a parking spot, if you sell that condominium unit, you no longer have that parking spot. The parking spot is sold with the condominium unit, even though you don't own the land that the parking spot is on. That is considered an appurtenance. Okay? So these are very weird, and you have to follow them. They can make the property more valuable or significantly less valuable if you don't track them. Water rights. Okay, we usually don't ask ourselves who owns the water or who has the right to the water, but it is becoming the most scarce resource of freshwater anyway, and there are several hedge funds which are set up simply to the ownership of water, okay? Particularly in the West. And in California, this is a large problem because it is in such high demand, and refiltration and desalination are extremely costly activities. Okay? So determining who owns that water right or acquiring the water right for yourself can make you very wealthy. Or investing in ETFs or hedge funds who are looking to do this can also make you very wealthy with little work on your end. Okay? So there are a few types of water rights we need to be aware of. Riparian right, which riparian just means the area between the stream and the bank of land. So that little cliff that exists on the edge of a river and the bank of land, that's called riparian, the riparian area. Okay? So the riparian right is the right of use of water along a stream. Anyone who has property which butts up to a stream has what is called riparian right. They have the right to use that water in a reasonable way, so long as it does not affect anybody else down the stream. So that means you can build a dock on it. You can tie your boat to that dock. You can go boating. You can go swimming. You can probably urinate in it, but you cannot defecate in it. Okay? The reason you can urinate is because it would just simply be diluted. You could not defecate in it because that would make the water toxic for the people downstream. Very careful distinction there. You cannot harm the individual's downstream use rights. That's riparian. Okay? Littoral is similar to riparian, all the same rights, reasonable use, cannot make the water toxic, but it has to do with lakes. Lakes and seas, littoral rights. Riparian is rivers and streams, littoral rights, lakes and seas. The doctrine of capture says that if you are going to drill for water, so long as you access the water first, you are able to use that water. You have the right to obtain percolation water, which is water below the surface, ground table water. So you can drill into that surface water and extract it for your own personal use. For example, a well. So you can drill a well, and what happens in a well is it's just a hole in the ground that's covered up, and water seeps into that hole to fill the gap. Okay? That's called percolation. And you can then pump the water out of that hole and use it for your everyday living. So that's doctrine of capture. Okay? You have the right on your property to access the water. Okay? Now, there's another doctrine of prior appropriation. A doctrine of prior appropriation. This actually goes against what is called with the riparian right. So the doctrine of prior appropriation versus the riparian right. Riparian right again said, you have the ability to use the water in the stream so long as you do so reasonably. The doctrine of prior appropriation is what is used in Western states like California because water is scarce. Okay? Under riparian right, you usually don't have scarcity of water. There's not a drought in the eastern states, okay? Past to the east of the Mississippi. Generally, there's enough water, and nobody has drought conditions where they have to fight over how much water is there. But in California, that is not the case. There are often drought conditions, and along a waterway, the person who is there first has the right to use the water first. So that is called the doctrine of prior appropriation. The individual who was on the waterway first has the right to use that water. So even if you are further up on the water head stream, so where the water comes out of the mountain, even if you are on the very beginning of that, you cannot touch that water unless you were there first. If somebody who is downstream, maybe 100 miles downstream, was there before you were, maybe in 1910 or earlier than that. They have the right to use the water before you use the water. Now that seems very strange to us, but if there was a drought to occur, and there was not enough water for the person who has the prior appropriation right, then they have to allow the person who's above them in the streamhead has to allow the water to go through first, okay? And allow the person who has the prior appropriation right to use all the water that they want, even though the other guy doesn't get any. Okay, so doctrine of prior appropriation is very powerful. And what that means is if you can purchase the property which had the prior appropriation right, then you have the right to use the water. And you can take all of the water if you want. And that's where this gets tricky. We're talking about the hedge funds trying to invest in properties which have water rights. Well, in California, you can do that. And California currently controls the majority of agribusiness in the United States, which requires a significant amount of water. So if you control the doctrine of prior appropriation, you control the use of the water, which controls agribusinesses. You control one of the vertical elements of the production chain, and you can demand whatever you like for it. It's a very profitable business. Excuse me, 1 second here. So, moving on to land description methods here. Here is an old description from Hartford, Connecticut at a probate court in 1812. They were trying to determine where this piece of land was, and as you can see from the description, these old methods left a lot to be desired for accuracy. So, commencing at the heap of stone, about a stone throw away from a certain small clump of alders, type of tree, near a brook running down off from a rather high part of said ridge, thence by a straight line to a certain marked white birch tree, marked how, about 2 or 3 times as far from a jog in a fence going round a ledge nearby, thence by another straight line in a different direction around said ledge, then by another straight line in a different direction to the stump of the big hemlock tree where Philo Blake killed the bear. Because we apparently remember who Philo Blake is. You can see that this led to a great deal of confusion and misunderstandings about where property lines were. So somewhere along the lines, we developed a better method of constructing readings for where land ended up. These are called meets and bounds. Okay, so you start from the fixed reference monument. So this is typically a man-made monument, something large like a church, which has a cornerstone. So the cornerstone not only tells you when the church was built, but provides a reference point for everything else in the town. Okay? Or you might use a granite pillar or a brass dial which is driven into the ground to let everyone know that this is the central reference point. Then you measure off a set of feet in a given degree mark, not market, from that monument, and you walk towards the point of beginning, which is the beginning of the property, and there are 2 ends in beginning, not 3. Sorry about that there. So the point of beginning is where your property begins, and from there you walk in a clockwise fashion around using the seconds and degrees to turn yourself and the feet to walk in a certain amount of distance along the perimeter of the parcel, and you keep turning. And such determines the meets, the distance, and the bounds, the direction of the land. Okay? So here is an example of a meets and bounds from George Washington. He drew this map here. He was purchasing, this is called River Farm. Okay, it's in West Virginia. So you can see there he has those dashed lines, which are part of the meets and bounds. And he was using natural monuments to try and label the corners of his meets and bounds. So this is the beginning cedar. Okay, the beginning cedar, so he's the beginning point. And by the way, Washington was a surveyor, so he did this for a living before he became general. So he starts at the beginning cedar, and then he walks onto this what's called white oak. Okay, we're circled in red there as well. And he walks along there, and then he makes another turn, and he comes around, and they come down the line, and they follow along the river, and he comes back to the beginning cedar. Okay, and this was the property of John Carney, okay, and Mary Henderson. Okay? And he purchased some of the land around that area and named it River Farm. Okay? So this is an example of a meets and bounds. As you can see, still not super accurate, but better than what we had before. Okay? Particularly because we have degrees and the length of the feet that you had to walk. And then we came up in 1785 with the rectangular survey system, authorized by Congress. But states that were part of the 13 colonies still used metes and bounds, as well as Texas, which was an independent republic for a very long time, so they used their own metes and bounds system still today. So all of those original 13 states, including West Virginia, which was part of Virginia, okay, used metes and bounds. So the rectangular survey system was created thereafter to update any new surveyed territory which was coming into the possession of the United States, particularly the Louisiana Purchase. The RSS system is a very logical system based on latitude and longitude lines. Latitude, for if you don't remember, are the flat ones, the horizontal ones. They're also called parallels. The longitude lines, or the vertical ones, also called meridians. They're spaced every 24 miles in each cardinal direction to form a gridwork over the Earth. But remember, because the Earth is a sphere, it tapers when you're going from north to south. Okay, so the longitude lines, they don't change. They're always the same distance between each other. Okay, but the latitude lines get closer together the closer you get to the poles. Okay, so once we separated these areas into 24 square mile zones, each of those is broken into a 6 by 6 mile townships. Careful, township, which is a political subdivision, is not the same as townships. Townships always with the S. Okay, although it is not plural. Townships, so you have townships A, 1. That is a single townships, but is still said with the S. Please understand. A township is a political subdivision. It means something different. So the townships are divided into 36 1 by 1 mile sections. So the 1 by 1 mile area is called a section. And each square mile contains 640 acres of land. So there's acres, which is a common unit of land used in today's parlance. We say, oh, I own 150 acres of land. And people supposedly understand what you're talking about. But I don't think many people today do unless they, in fact, own land themselves. So reference to the parcel within the acreage of land use for the quarter and section identification to the parcel as well. This is quite unique, but it tells you exactly if you're looking in the lat books, which I mentioned at the beginning, which are in the courthouse. You've got all of those books with a number and then a page number. And in that page, you've got a coordinate grid system that looks like this. Okay? And you're looking within the sections. Okay? And you're saying, okay, well, within this section, I want to use the northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast corner. Well, my farm is in the southwest. So I say in the southwest quarter of section 7. Okay? And then we say, oh, well, my farm is in the southeast corner of that southwest corner. And in fact, it's in the southwest corner of that southeast corner of that southwest corner. As you can see there, SW, SE, SW, section 7. Okay? Township 9, range 5. Okay? Range is going east to west. Township is going north to south. Okay, well, we can just refer to that there. So if you see, I've got it here. You can see my mouse there. Southwest section of the southeast of the southwest, section 7. Okay, so again, up to section 7, southwest, southeast of that, the southwest of that. Okay, and we look even deeper therein. We can say over here, well, the description for the largest to the smallest area, we can go backwards. Okay, and we can say, well, we are in the 9th section of the 5th east section, if we were to label them in the 30th unit of that. Okay? So we can go backwards and forwards, but predominantly we will use the SW southwest of the southeast of the southwest of section 7. Okay? And this image is taken from the Kansas Geological Survey. So they actually use this in Kansas. And Kansas, being a very square state, led itself very well to the use of this RSS system. Informal references, okay, are typically used for postal service uses and also for lease agreements. We do not use them for formal real estate agreements for sales or deed transfers because they're not specific enough. But for the purpose of real estate, it is easy enough for us for the leases, to say within the lease agreement we are talking about unit number 2 in 212E Baker Street. We now know which unit you are talking about, and it is sufficient for the court to determine that a lease agreement has occurred for that condominium or that apartment unit. However, if we were to sell the entire apartment building, we would need a description of the lot, the land itself. Okay? And that's where we would need the southwest, southeast, southwest again, section 7 of Township 9, range 5. Okay? And we'd say, well, there we know where the land is, and we know specifically what apartment building you're talking about. Because it is much more important that we do not screw up who or where we sell the apartment building at, okay, than if we screwed up a lease agreement. So it has to do with importance here. Air and subsurface rights, which we talked about before. So again, we're referring to the vertical land, okay? How far up or down we're talking about has to be to a reference point called a datum, okay? So sea level is usually used for the reference point. So we're 500 feet above sea level. Okay? We know, everyone knows what we're talking about now, okay? We can use the meets and bounds, or we can use the RSS system to figure out where on Earth we're going, and then we use the datum reference to figure out, well, how above the surface or below the surface are we talking? Okay? So an air lot may be identified based on the parcel of the land, so we tell, well, this is the surface lot, and how elevated in the air that land is. So an air lot over lot 26 of block 17, and lying between the elevation of 575 feet and 625 feet above sea level. So it seems like a two-story apartment unit or condo that you might have purchased there. Okay, so that would be a specific identification of a condo unit. You can also describe mineral rights in the same way, but they're usually referred to based on the surface ground itself being the datum of reference. Okay, so the 500 feet below the surface, that's our mineral rights. Okay? I would like to drill 500 feet below the surface, or I would like to drill the tranche 500 to 600 feet below the surface. You tell me exactly what the area of land that I can drill from is, and what my property rights are. And when you try to sell property rights for mineral rights, it would behoove you to be very specific about what you will allow to be drilled. If you wrote 500 feet and below, you have given up all rights to the center of the core of the earth. I realize that seems silly, because nobody's going to go to the center of the core of the earth, but legally that is what you have done. Okay? So you may have given up coal rights, is what you thought, only 500 feet below to 1,000 feet below, because it's not going to exist anywhere else. But there may be oil rights below that as well. But because you gave up all mineral rights 500 feet and below, you have now just given the coal company that oil. And they can sell the oil to an oil company. And they get the profit, not you. Okay? So be very careful about what you're going to sell for the mineral rights. It's very important. All right, types of lots. Okay, again, we said lots where they are placed matters for the price of the property. It also matters for easements. Okay, so here we've got, for example, double frontage lots. Okay, the reason they're called double frontage is they touch the street twice. Okay, so imagine that they touch the street over here and they touch the street here. A cul-de-sac is the circle area. Some of you may have lived in them before, where a street comes in and there's a roundabout. It's a dead end effectively, but you can turn around here. That's the cul-de-sac. Okay, and there are interior lots to the cul-de-sac. Okay, or cul-de-sac lots as they are called. Okay, a corner lot is a lot which sits on the corner of a street axis. Okay, so notice there's a corner lot here because it sits on the corner of a street. There's a corner lot here because it sits on the corner of a street. This is a corner lot. This is a corner lot. This is called an interior lot, but it can also be called a key lot. Key, K-E-Y. Okay, key lot. This is the double frontage lot because it accesses the street two ways. Okay. This looks like streef some way. It looks like F's there. But accesses the street on two sides there. Okay. But this can also be called a T lot. So imagine that there was no street here. This wasn't street. This was another piece of property. Then the double frontage lot is not double frontage. It doesn't have two accesses to streets. And instead it becomes what is known as a T lot. Okay, or a flag lot. Okay, so the flag lot here is important because you access it from this area, okay, and the rest of your property is over here, behind somebody else's property. That is called a flag lot. And you will often see a flag lot happen when somebody who has the corner lot, they own maybe this entire section of land, but they want to sell this part, okay? Even though nobody can get to it, okay, because they own all this land here as well, nobody can get to this lot, but they want to sell it. So what happens is they give up a part of this land and it becomes a T-lot. And the reason they give up a part of this land rather than just keep it is because an easement would be created regardless. Okay? So the person would have the right to build a driveway around here just so they could get onto their property. And because they have that right of easement, people usually just say, okay, we'll just stop here. This will be my new property line. I will give this section to this guy. So they don't have to deal with the easement problems. Okay? So property lots, again, they help determine the value of the property. Again, a corner lot is more expensive than a key lot or an interior lot. Okay? Has more access to the street, therefore it is considered more valuable. Okay? Double frontage corner lots are more expensive as well. So keep that in mind. All right, that is the end for this set of chapters here today. We will continue on with the remaining chapters 3 and 4 in the next video lecture, which will be posted here this afternoon as well. And then that will be it for this week. We will have the remainder of the chapters next week as well. Look forward to talking to you guys then. Bye.